Welcome to the Jaco Report. I'm Charles Jaco. Next week, the Missouri State Board of Education meets here in St. Louis, and at that meeting, they're expected to turn control of the St. Louis Public Schools back over to an elected school board. As you probably know, since 2007, the city's public schools have been run by a three-person appointed special administrative board. Now, those folks took over for two reasons. One, the city's schools lost their academic accreditation, and two, the elected board had degenerated into a clown car. Some of their greatest hits: elected school board member Rochelle Moore put a curse on former Mayor Frances Slay. She asked black people to arm themselves to defend her. She dumped a pitcher of water on a school administrator, and a judge finally removed her from office. The elected board hired a corporate firm to sell off school buildings when one of the merry-go-round of short-term superintendents ended up suing board member Bill Haas for libel. Elected board president Veronica O'Brien snatched a phone from Superintendent Diana Borisaw's hands while she was talking to a state senator. Meanwhile, the St. Louis Public Schools sank. The state-appointed board hired our guest today in 2008 as superintendent, and since then, school performance has improved, attendance has improved, accreditation's been restored, a $25 million deficit turned into around a $70 million plus surplus. So what's ahead for the St. Louis Public Schools with an elected board taking back over? Joining us to talk about that and the state of our city schools is St. Louis Public School Superintendent Dr. Kelvin Adams. Dr. Adams, great to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Great to see you. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Okay, you took over in 2008.
Yes, sir.
You came here from New Orleans. What do you know now that you didn't know then?
I know that it's colder than I thought it was, but on the real side, I think what I found out is that there are enough persons in this city who really care about kids to really make a difference. And so the kind of partnerships that we have been able to create and foster have been a result of people really caring about wanting to make a difference for kids.
Now, when you talk about the partnerships you've been able to foster, give me a for instance.
Big Brothers and Big Sisters. Today is, I think, Becky's a number of years that she's been head of Big Brothers and Big Sisters, but the partnerships are allowing bigs to adopt kids and support them. Enterprise giving us $5 million to support early child education. And I could go on and on and on, the kind of partnerships that have taken place. Creating our own foundation that raises about $3 to $5 million a year to support early child education, college and career, health and wellness, and trauma-informed care for our kids. So those are the kind of partnerships that have taken place that I'm really proud about, that were really already there, but weren't really nurtured in a way that we have tried to do over the last 10 years.
Now, the progress you guys have made over the last 10, 11 years has all been under this three-person special administrative board. You've always worked under them. They're the ones who hired you. Now, next week, probably control is going to be returned to an elected school board, 7 people. It was awful before. I mean, it was an embarrassment nationally in terms of the things that the then elected school board in various iterations did with and to the public schools. How concerned are you that in the transition from this appointed 3-member board to the elected board, we're going to repeat that nonsense again?
I am not concerned. I frankly am not at all. I've been working with the board for the last year, the elected board, as we walk through a transition process. That transition process has generated about 50 hours of training for them, with my staff and myself providing that training. Also, the National School Board Association and Missouri School Board Association work with them around that training. Since January, we've had mock board meetings. We've actually had agendas from the SAB that we meet in closed session and discuss matters of personnel and real estate, with the names being redacted, such that they're actually making decisions as if they are the board in place. And we've actually had open meetings before the public, January, February, and March. We had a meeting last week, as a matter of fact, on Tuesday, that lasted about an hour and a half, as we walked through the agenda items that will be agenda items that they would have voted on.
And what's your impression of this, the elected school board?
I think they're really conscientious around learning about what the district deficits are and how they can improve those deficits. So I'm confident, based upon the information that I have and based on the interactions that have taken place over the last year, that they have prepared themselves. Now, let's just be real. They don't know what they don't know yet, in the sense that they have not been in place. The SAB had to learn those things as well. And so I'm very, 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 very hopeful that the kind of work that has taken place over the last year will generate itself in the board responding in the way that the public wants them to respond.
Now, you noted before we went on the air that the turnout in the school board election was pretty low, as they generally are in school board elections around the country. Is that one of the reasons sometimes we end up with elected school boards that may be less than desirable? Because if almost nobody votes, a few group of activists or extremists or whatever, a fairly small group can put people on a school board.
Well, I remember reading an article about the last election in October, November, when the alderman, the head of the president of the Board of Aldermen was elected, and there was some conversation then about changing how people vote. In Ferguson, at the school board election, persons can vote twice for one candidate. The notion is to try to get people more involved in these kinds of elections that don't seem to have a lot of support. So I don't know if that's the reason why certain persons get on the board, but I do think there is a belief that more people need to be engaged in the political process, and schools are a very important piece of that political process. So I don't want to say that that's the reason why, but I do think the belief is that more people need to vote and care about what's happening in public education.
Now, you've got roughly 22,000 kids in the St. Louis public schools. Got about over 4,000 of those kids are homeless. You've got a lot of kids who come from extremely poor families where parenting, either because of neglect or because mom's busy working 3 jobs trying to keep the family together, is not there. A lot of them come from terrible neighborhoods where they're probably suffering from a form of PTSD the moment they walk through the door. How does the education challenge change when you're dealing with a vulnerable and, quite frankly, abused population of kids by the time they come in your front doors?
I think the challenge for us, quite frankly, Mr. Jaco, is the challenge of being very intentional around understanding that and looking at resources that can align themselves to support them. I'm proud of the work that we've done, but I realize and understand that we work in the context of high poverty, high crime, and the notion that housing is a real challenge for many of our families, because you just talked about the homeless issue. So I think we work diligently to find resources through partnerships or use our own dollars to provide services to kids who have the greatest needs. And obviously, you just articulated a large number of them. So we just can't talk about reading, writing, and arithmetic. We also have to talk about counseling. We have to talk about how do we provide housing for kids. So how do we do it? We do it with an intentionality around understanding that and looking for resources to support those kids.
Now, the St. Louis public schools have had, certainly given what they faced before, a remarkable turnaround in the last decade or so. Accreditation's been restored, academic test scores have gone up, and you have tried to focus on the schools in the bottom half or the bottom third, trying to say, okay, we need to focus there. At one point, and please correct me if I'm wrong, we're going to set up a superintendent's district where there would be tighter control over these schools, and now there's kind of a 180 from that, where these schools that are low performing are being given more autonomy. Explain that change to me, and how does giving the least performing schools more autonomy make things better?
So you are 100% correct. We had 18 schools that were part of the superintendent's zone schools, and we saw some improvement in some of those schools, not totally. I would say of the 18 schools, about 5 or 6 of the schools showed substantial improvement and never will go back into that area. But the state identified another 17 schools most recently that are called comprehensive targeted schools based on receiving Title I funds. And so we came up with a plan to look at giving those schools autonomy, because we believe that the persons who are closest to the schools can make the best decisions for those schools. They will still have a requirement to meet certain standards, but we want the persons on the ground who are in those schools every single day and not central office staff to determine what's best for those schools.
So what would some of that autonomy look like that would differentiate these schools from others?
Excellent question. One of the things that the schools are looking at, because there are 2 schools that we consider to be part of this CPN Consortium Partnership Network that will be run by an outside 5-member board, that I'm a member of the board and the president of the SAB is a member of the board, and likely if the elected board comes back, they will be as well. But some of the autonomy might be they want to change the bus time, moving from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock. They may want to increase the class size from 20 to 1 to 22 to 1 with the idea that they get a full-time social worker or a counselor or a nurse. When right now we determine what that looks like. They may determine that they want to use another curriculum, or they may determine they want reading to be not 1 hour but 3 hours. That's the kind of autonomy that that school could have. Right now we determine that. We will give them the flexibility based on their own data to say this is what we want to do. That's the kind of autonomy that we're talking about, and the flexibility. Right now, that's hard to do in the structure that we have because we are managing 67 schools, 42 elementary schools, 8 middle schools, and some 13 or 15 high schools. And so we are giving 2 elementary schools the ability to say, we want to do it this way.
Enrollment in St. Louis public schools have been dropping for years. There's been population loss in the city. Has a lot of that drop, though, been due to kids and their parents either opting for parochial or private or charter schools?
We did some deep dives around the data 3 years ago, 2 years ago, and what we found was that the majority of kids were not necessarily going to charters. The majority of the kids were leaving the city. We found that they were moving to Illinois and moving to different parts.
So it's population loss.
Population loss, yes, sir.
But when it comes to charter schools, I found this interesting. Charter schools, of course, are set up as public schools, but there's almost no oversight, and yet they get public school money. A lot has been made of the fact that a system like the SLPS comes in for very focused, very tight oversight, where a lot of the charter schools, it's kind of la-di-da, let them do what they want to. Do you feel that we've been sold a bill of goods on the effectiveness of charter schools? Or would you take it that far? I mean, what's your view of the success or lack of success overall of the charter school experience here that you've seen?
I think charter schools would disagree with you and say that they do have oversight. They would say that they have sponsors that hold them accountable, but they would say that DESE, the State Department of Education, doesn't necessarily have the same oversight for them as they do for traditional schools. I think the results are mixed, and I think they will be the first to tell you that the results are mixed. There have been some charter schools that have done really, really well, outperformed district schools, but there have been charter schools that have failed. Every single year that I've been here as superintendent, every single year with the exception of one, we've had to intervene and support a charter school closing. That speaks to the whole notion of it. They have not been 100% successful. Sold a bill of goods, I don't know if that's the right terminology, but I would say that there should be caution to the wind for any new organization that opens up, whether it's a charter school or a business that deals with food. You want to make sure that they are at a quality that they can provide the services that you want.
Now, a lot that's been involved in the turnaround of the St. Louis Public School District has been inside baseball that most people aren't aware of. Administrative changes, getting the finances in order, working out curriculum assignments, and that sort of things. But in terms of something that the general public and the parents could wrap their hands around, what do you think has been the one biggest thing that's been responsible for this turnaround in the last decade? Is it increased parental involvement? Is it more rigorous academic standards? Did a pot of money suddenly fall from the sky? I mean, what do you think the one thing is that speaks to that?
Unfortunately, I don't think it's one thing, but if I had to name one thing, I think it's stability. You've had stability. You've had a superintendent in place for the last 11 years or 10 years. You've had the same 3 board members with the exception of one. Dr. Adams left about 3 years ago. A stability of the board. And so that stability creates all of the kinds of things you're talking about. The notion that we moved from about 55% of our students graduating to 78% of our students graduating. The fact that you talked about a $25 million deficit to a $70 million surplus because voters had confidence in the persons who were leading the district. And so I think stability, in a word, stability.
Which gets us back to the
Yes.
initial idea that with the elected board, are you afraid some of that stability is going to go out the window? Because with all due respect to them, even if they're incredibly well-meaning people, they are in essence politicians. They have to stand for re-election at some point. There's sort of an instability built into the system. Is that concerning to you?
Not concerning, because I think we put some systems in place that make it that allow the stability to continue. some systems in place around attendance, the kinds of things you talked about, some systems in place in terms of how we manage and budget dollars, some systems in place in terms of how we hire staff. So I think we have put some systems in place. And part of my hope and belief is that the training that has taken place over the last year, the opportunity to work with them and meet with them, has helped them understand that that stability is in place. And quite frankly, they want to keep that same stability in place. Every indication I have is that's what they want to do.
What's the one thing you're looking for right now, the next hurdle for the St. Louis Public Schools with the kids? Is it part of this holistic approach of having to deal with kids who come from, you know, abusive backgrounds, and I don't necessarily mean the parents are abusive,
Right.
it's the neighborhoods they live in? Is it more traditional in terms of targeting reading or math scores and getting them up? Is it capital expenditures where you'd like to get rid of old buildings and bring on new ones? I mean, where's your next hurdle? What's the next target you have in mind?
I think you named all of them, quite frankly. I think you did an excellent job of naming what the real challenges are. I think number one is the transition. Obviously, creating a smooth transition between the SAB and the elected board. I think that's one of the things that we are obviously concerned about. Secondly, from a curriculum perspective, is obviously reading. We want to do our best to try to increase reading. We put $1 million on the side this year to focus on reading, to support schools in that area. From an infrastructure perspective, you're right. We have old buildings. We have some 67 buildings. Do we have too many buildings? Can we continue to consolidate and better utilize some of the dollars we have to spend in a better way as opposed to having 67 buildings? I think that's another challenge.
So do you see more school closings perhaps around the corner?
I see that we have to make some decisions, some hard decisions around what needs to happen. I have schools that have 189 kids for a building that normally would occupy 400. So I think that's a challenge that we have to have.
Are these elementary, middle, high schools?
Elementary, some middle, and some high schools, quite frankly, a little bit of both. And so we've closed 17 schools in 10 years. I think the challenge for us is to go back and look again to see how we might need to better consolidate our resources, and obviously school closing becomes part of that.
But school closing is fraught with emotion because you've got people who went to school there, you've got people in the neighborhoods who think, my God, the school was the only thing stable in this neighborhood. Again, that becomes political, but in a completely different way.
I think we still have to address it. I don't think we can walk away from it. I think those are the kind of hard decisions that superintendents have to make and boards have to look to review.
Any word on the specific, I mean, for example, you mentioned high schools. Are there specific high schools you're looking at?
No, not anything specific. We're looking at all of our schools, quite frankly. We have not determined if this is this school or this school. I've had conversations with alumni associations from different schools over the last 6 months talking about the challenges, and many of those schools are working to help us recruit.
Real quickly, for people who might be watching this who are mostly familiar with mostly white, mostly middle-class suburban school districts, they know what the parent-teacher-student relationship is there. Taking you inside the classroom, how are things significantly different given the problems the kids face, given they're kids, so they're as eager to learn as any other kids anywhere?
Yes.
Given poverty, given that it's overwhelmingly African American, given that there's sometimes a lack of parental involvement for a variety of reasons. I mean, inside the classroom, on the chalkboard or whiteboard level, the difference between these middle-class schools people might be familiar with and the schools you are in charge of?
I think there are two big differences. One, resources. The real challenge is sometimes...
You don't have enough of them.
Well, I think the resources for the number of students that we have or the issues that students have, whether that's additional social workers or counselors or those kinds of things, that's kind of what I'm talking about.
And because it goes well beyond just the academics.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. So full-time social workers, full-time nurses, the state doesn't provide for those services, so we have to take academic dollars to support that. That's number one. And number two, helping better defining parent engagement and involvement. In the schools that you talk about that are in the county, there's a likelihood or belief that parents care more. I would totally disagree. I think parents care equally as much in schools in the city. I think the challenge is those families have other issues that they're addressing and dealing with. So how do we best support those? What kind of wraparound services are put in place? LeBron James opened a school in Ohio. One of the things that he guaranteed was the fact that he was working to have persons help families get jobs. Because if you could take that pressure off them around jobs and housing, it reduces the challenges that they have in terms of how much time they have to devote to their children. Those are some of the kind of creative things that we're looking at, because it's not just the kid, it's the whole family that we have to be concerned about in many cases, and that may not be the same for the large percentage of kids in the county.
Did I see you just signed a contract through, what, 2022?
I did sign a contract with 2022.
So you're going to have to keep the earmuffs for a while longer.
I will.
Dr. Kelvin Adams. Doctor, thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
coming in. It was my pleasure. Our thanks to Dr. Kelvin Adams from the St. Louis Public School System, and our thanks to you for joining us. Make sure you join us back here next week for another edition of the Jaco Report. See you then.